There's a specific kind of pain that doesn't have a clear name. It's not failure. It's not jealousy exactly. It's what you feel when you watch someone else move through the world with wind at their back. The right parents, the right connections, the mentor who believed in them before they believed in themselves. And you realize, quietly, that you are moving through the same world with none of that. Same ambition, same hours, different starting line. You tell yourself it doesn't matter. You tell yourself you'll outwork it. But somewhere underneath the discipline and the grind, a question lives that you haven't let yourself ask out loud. What if the absence of support isn't just a disadvantage? What if it makes certain things genuinely impossible? That question isn't a weakness, it's honesty, and it deserves an honest answer. Here's the diagnosis. Not the comfortable one, but the real one. The struggle you're feeling isn't primarily a resource problem. It's an identity problem wearing the mask of a resource problem. The absence of support doesn't just slow your progress. It forces a confrontation with a question that most people, the ones with the mentors, the family backing, the open doors, never have to answer. Who are you when no one is there to tell you? Most people never find out. Not because they're weak, but because the scaffolding around them never fully collapses. There is always someone to reflect their worth back to them. Always a structure that absorbs the silence before it gets too loud. They move through life with a self that was largely constructed for them, by the approval and expectation of others, and they never notice. Because why would you notice an architecture you've never had to build yourself? Carl Jung noticed. Not as a theoretical observation, but as a lived experience. When he broke from Freud in 1913, he didn't just lose a colleague. He lost the most powerful validator in his professional world. The psychoanalytic establishment turned its back. The institutional framework that had given his work legitimacy dissolved. What remained was Jung, alone, with his ideas, and no one to confirm they were worth anything. What he did in that solitude, and what he discovered about the psyche through it, became the foundation of everything he would later build. He didn't emerge from isolation weaker. He emerged as someone who knew exactly who he was because he had been forced to find out without anyone's help. That is what this video is about. Not motivation, not a list of habits for the person who has nothing. Jung's framework reveals something more precise and more unsettling, that the absence of external support, when confronted consciously, can accelerate the development of psychological autonomy in a way that supported paths almost never do. The people who seem to have everything may be building faster, but they may also be building on borrowed ground. By the end of this, you will understand why. You will also understand the two traps that destroy most people who walk this path, and how close you probably are to one of them right now. This won't be easy to hear, but the alternative, continuing to frame your situation as purely a disadvantage or pushing through it on raw force without understanding what it's actually doing to you, is more expensive than the discomfort ahead. The first thing to understand is what you've actually been building your sense of self on, and what happens when that structure was never there to begin with. Most people believe their confidence comes from within. It doesn't. It comes from a long history of external confirmation that was eventually internalized, so slowly, so seamlessly, that it began to feel like it was theirs all along. Jung saw this clearly. The self that most people walk around with isn't something they built. It's something they inherited. Piece by piece, through parental approval and institutional validation, and the steady accumulation of other people's belief in them, a structure was assembled. It functions like a self. It feels like a self. But its foundations run outward, not inward. And that distinction matters enormously when the ground shifts. Think about what it actually means to grow up with support. It means someone told you that you were capable before you had evidence. It means a mentor pointed you in a direction and you trusted the direction because you trusted the person. It means that when doubt appeared, and it always appears, there was a voice outside you, ready to dissolve it. Over time, you stopped needing the voice as frequently. You had absorbed it. The confidence felt self-generated because the original source had become invisible. That's not a flaw. That's how psychological development is supposed to work, under normal conditions. The problem is that it produces a self that has never been tested in isolation. A self that, if you removed every external mirror, might not know what it looks like. Jung experienced this directly after the break with Freud. Stripped of institutional standing, rejected by the establishment that had once embraced him, he found himself facing what he would later describe as a confrontation with the unconscious. A period of profound disorientation in which the identity he had built through professional recognition began to lose its coherence. He didn't know, in any stable sense, who he was outside of that structure. And that terrifying uncertainty was the beginning of something real. In the development of personality, Jung makes an observation that cuts to the bone. Genuine personality doesn't develop through advice, encouragement, or favorable conditions. It develops through necessity, not the comfortable necessity of having to choose between two good options, but the acute necessity of having no external structure to fall back on. The psyche, he argues, is profoundly conservative. It will not do the hard work of becoming unless it absolutely must. This is the hidden cost of support that no one talks about. When the environment around you absorbs the silence, fills the uncertainty, and confirms your worth before you've proven it to yourself, it also removes the pressure that forces genuine development. The scaffolding holds you up, but it also holds you in place. You have never had that scaffolding, and the absence of it has been doing something to you that you may have been interpreting entirely wrong. What felt like disadvantage has also been pressure. What felt like abandonment has also been a forcing function. Every decision you made without anyone's validation, every doubt you had to metabolize alone, every failure that landed without a safety net. These weren't just losses. They were the conditions under which a real self either forms or fractures. The question is, which one is happening in you? And the answer to that depends almost entirely on whether you've been running from what the silence reveals, or learning to stay inside it long enough to hear what it's actually saying. Because the silence doesn't stay silent for long. When external support disappears, something else moves into the space it occupied. Most people have never had to meet it directly. You don't have that luxury. In the next part, we'll look at what actually lives in that space, and why the confrontation you've been avoiding may be the most important one of your life. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. There is a reason people fill their lives with noise. Commitments, conversations, the endless scroll, the plans that never quite materialize, but always occupy mental space. It rarely occurs to them that the noise is functional, that it is doing a specific job, which is to prevent a specific encounter. Not with failure, not with other people, with themselves. Jung named what lives in that silence. He called it the shadow, the sum of everything the psyche has refused to integrate. Not just the darkness, the impulses and fears you'd rather not claim. Also, the unlived life, the potential that was never given permission. The version of you that got buried under who you were told to be, who you needed to be to earn approval, who you performed so consistently that even you forgot it was a performance. Most people get to keep the noise, the social obligations, the family structures, the professional ecosystems. They all generate enough external stimulation to ensure the encounter with the shadow stays theoretical. Something to read about, something to find interesting at a comfortable distance. You don't have that buffer. When the external support structure is thin or absent, the noise thins with it. And what remains is not peace. It's everything you have been successfully not looking at. The resentment you've been calling ambition. The grief you've been calling motivation. The fear of being fundamentally alone that you've been calling independence. This is where most people on your path make the first fatal mistake. The silence arrives, and instead of recognizing it as the beginning of something necessary, they panic and fill it with overwork, with bitterness, with the performance of not needing anyone. Anything to avoid sitting inside what the absence of support actually feels like when you stop managing it. Jung distinguished carefully between two states that look similar from the outside. Loneliness is the suffering of being alone, passive, unwanted, corrosive. It is what happens when you are isolated and you resist it. Solitude is something entirely different. It is the conscious choice to remain in the encounter with your own interior, however uncomfortable, because you understand that what you find there is more real than anything the external world was reflecting back at you. One destroys, the other builds. The difference between them is not circumstance, it is orientation. Two people can be in identical isolation, and one will be consumed by loneliness, while the other undergoes something closer to transformation. What separates them is whether they are running from the silence or running toward what it contains. What it contains, for most people who have walked through life without support, is a profound and unasked question. What do I actually want, separate from what I was trying to prove? Because so much of what drives the unsupported person isn't desire, it's defiance. The hunger to succeed is real, but underneath it, if you press, is often something raw. The need to demonstrate to everyone who didn't show up that they were wrong not to. That's not a foundation. That's a wound pretending to be an engine. Jung would say, the shadow doesn't care how productive your wound has been. It will keep surfacing until you look at it directly. And looking at it directly is not the same as being destroyed by it. It is, in fact, the only way to stop being controlled by it. The people who are supported never have to do this reckoning at this depth. Their structure catches them before the fall gets long enough to be revealing. You have fallen far enough to see things they haven't. That is not consolation. It is information. What you do with that information, whether you let it accelerate your development or calcify into bitterness, is the entire question. And it leads directly to what Jung discovered about how genuine personality actually forms under pressure. That's what comes next. Why necessity, not talent or support, is the real engine of individuation. Here is something no one tells you about becoming who you are. It doesn't happen because you decide to. It doesn't happen because conditions are favorable, because someone believes in you, or because you've read the right books and understood the right frameworks. Jung was unambiguous about this. Personality, real personality, not the social performance of one, develops through necessity. Not comfort, not encouragement. Necessity. In the development of personality, he puts it plainly. Without necessity, nothing budges. The psyche is conservative by nature. It will remain exactly as it is for as long as the environment allows it to. Give a person enough external structure, enough validation, enough direction, enough of other people's certainty to borrow, and the deeper work of becoming simply won't happen. There is no pressure to force it. The scaffolding holds everything in place, including the unfinished interior. This is not a moral failing. It is psychology. The psyche takes the path of least resistance, like everything else in nature. And when the path of least resistance runs outward, toward other people's approval, other people's maps, other people's belief in you, the inward path stays untraveled, not because the person is lazy or shallow, because they never had to go there. You have had to go there. Not because you are exceptional, and not because suffering is inherently purifying. Jung had no patience for that kind of romanticism. But because the outward path was closed, the approval wasn't available, the mentor didn't appear, the resources didn't materialize. And when the outward path closes, the psyche faces a choice it would never have made voluntarily: go inward or collapse. What happens when a person chooses, consciously, painfully, without guarantee, To go inward is what Jung spent his life trying to describe. He called it individuation, the process by which the psyche moves toward wholeness, integrating what has been rejected, developing what has been undeveloped, becoming something that could not have been assembled from the outside. It is not a comfortable process. It is not a linear one, but it produces something that external support, however generous, structurally cannot. A self that was forged rather than inherited. The person who was handed confidence knows what confidence feels like. The person who built it from nothing, in the absence of anyone confirming it was warranted, knows something different. Not just what confidence feels like, but what it is made of. That knowledge is not transferable. It cannot be given. It can only be earned through the specific conditions you have been living in. Here is what that means practically. Every decision you made without validation was a repetition of a single proof. Your judgment exists and can function without external endorsement. Every failure you absorbed without a safety net demonstrated something that supported people spend their whole lives untested on. That you can be broken by circumstances and continue anyway. Every period of doubt you metabolized alone strengthened a capacity that comfort systematically prevents. The ability to locate your own signal in the absence of external noise. None of this was painless. None of it was fair. But fairness is not the question Jung is asking. The question is what the pressure has been building in you, and whether you have been conscious enough of the process to let it build the right things. Because pressure without consciousness doesn't produce individuation. It produces two other things instead. And most people on this path fall into one of them without ever realizing it. Two traps, equally convincing, equally destructive, waiting exactly where the road gets hardest. That's where we're going next. When external support is absent long enough, the psyche doesn't stay neutral. It moves. And the direction it moves, without conscious intervention, is almost always toward one of two positions that feel like coping, but function like prisons. The first is victimization. Not the acknowledgement that circumstances are genuinely harder without support. That is simply true, and pretending otherwise is its own kind of damage. Victimization is what happens when that truth calcifies into identity. When "this is harder for me" quietly becomes "therefore it is impossible for me." When the injustice of the situation, and it is unjust, Jung would never ask you to pretend otherwise, becomes the explanation for every failure and the justification for every retreat. The bitterness feels like clarity. It has the texture of realism, but it is a closed system. Nothing new can enter it because everything that enters gets recruited as further evidence of the original wound. Jung understood bitterness as a particularly insidious defense. It protects you from the vulnerability of trying and failing in the open. If the system is rigged, then your failures aren't really yours. And neither, quietly, are your possibilities. The bitterness that feels like it's directed outward is always also directed inward, foreclosing something. Every person who has walked this path has felt it. The question is whether you let it settle. The second trap is its mirror image, and it is just as lethal. Call it the heroic refusal. The decision, made somewhere below conscious awareness, that needing nothing and no one is not a wound, but a superpower. The unsupported person who has been hurt enough times eventually stops reaching, and then begins to construct a philosophy around the not reaching. Independence becomes ideology. Solitude becomes armor. The person who once needed connection and was denied it now insists with complete conviction that they never needed it at all. Jung was precise about what this costs. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he describes the period after the Freud break not as a triumphant embrace of isolation, but as a dangerous confrontation with disintegration, one that required him to maintain real anchors in the world. His family, his clinical work, small but genuine connections that kept him tethered to human reality while the interior work proceeded. He did not romanticize the alone. He endured it, consciously, while resisting the temptation to make a virtue of what was simply a necessity. The heroic refusal to need anyone looks like strength. It is, in most cases, a sophisticated avoidance of the grief of having been unsupported, of the risk of reaching again, of the admission that connection is not weakness, but a genuine human requirement. The person who builds this wall doesn't become stronger. They become more defended. And defended is not the same as developed. What both traps share is the same root, an unconscious response to pain that bypasses the actual work. Victimization bypasses it by making the external world fully responsible. Heroic isolation bypasses it by making the self fully sufficient. Both are fictions. Both feel, from the inside, like they are protecting something real. The path between them is narrow. It requires holding two things simultaneously that the psyche desperately wants to resolve into one: the genuine injustice of your circumstances and the genuine agency you still possess within them. Not one or the other. Both, in full tension, without resolution. That tension is not a problem to be solved. It is the condition under which the real work happens. And what that work produces, slowly, without announcement, without anyone watching, is something that neither the bitter nor the isolated ever build. We're about to look at exactly what that is. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. There is a version of this conversation that ends with reassurance. Something about how your struggle is building character, how the difficulty is secretly a gift, how one day you'll look back and understand why it had to be this way. That's not what Jung is offering. What he's offering is more precise and more demanding than comfort. Here is what is actually true. People with substantial external support frequently progress faster. That is not a myth you need to deconstruct to feel better about your situation. It is real. Open doors open faster when someone holds them for you. Confidence moves differently when it was injected early by people whose opinion you trusted. Resources compress timelines. Networks convert effort into opportunity at a rate that raw talent alone cannot match. If you've been watching this happen in real time, you haven't been imagining it. But here is what is also true, and what rarely gets examined with the same honesty. What support accelerates, it also shapes. And the shape it produces carries a structural vulnerability that only becomes visible under specific conditions, specifically the condition of the support being removed. Jung observed that the people most destabilized by failure, rejection, and isolation were rarely those who had struggled from the beginning. They were the ones who had been well supported and then weren't. The mentor who disappeared, the family structure that collapsed, the professional identity that dissolved. When the scaffolding came down, what was revealed beneath it was often shockingly thin. Not because the person was weak, but because the scaffolding had been doing work they didn't know was being done on their behalf. What you have been forced to build instead is harder to see because it has no obvious external form. It doesn't look like a credential or a connection or a vote of confidence from someone whose approval carries institutional weight. It looks like this. You made a decision in genuine uncertainty and lived with the consequences. You failed without a net and didn't permanently stop. You doubted yourself in complete silence and found, eventually, something in the silence that held. That process, repeated, unglamorous, unwitnessed, is the mechanism by which an interior structure forms that no one can dismantle from the outside because no one built it from the outside. In The Development of Personality, Jung describes the developed personality as something that cannot be shaken by collective panic, cannot be reoriented by the withdrawal of approval, cannot be collapsed by the removal of external structures, because it is not resting on any of those things. It was forged in the place those things cannot reach. That description is not an aspiration for you. It is a description of what the conditions of your life have been constructing, whether you recognized the construction or not. This is the asymmetry that gets lost in the comparison between your path and theirs. They are building faster. You are building differently. And differently, in this specific case, means building something that belongs entirely to you. Auto-valor that was tested before it was claimed, resilience that was proven before it was named, a capacity for independent judgment that was developed not as a preference but as a survival requirement. The risk, of course, is that none of this matters if the building stops, if the pressure produces not a forged self but a fractured one, if the isolation tips from solitude into something that closes rather than opens. The difference between those two outcomes is not talent or luck or even effort. It is consciousness, the willingness to understand what the process is actually doing and to navigate it with intention rather than just endure it. You have been enduring it. That is not nothing. But endurance alone is not the destination. What comes next is the question of who you are becoming through all of this, and whether you are ready to hear the answer. At some point, the question of whether you can win without support has to give way to a harder question. Not can you, but who are you becoming in the attempt? Because that is what this has always been about. Underneath the grind and the comparison and the quiet inventory of everything you were never given. Jung's answer to that question is not motivational. It is almost uncomfortably plain. The self that emerges from genuine necessity, from having to locate your own values without anyone confirming them, your own direction without anyone pointing, your own worth without anyone reflecting it back, is the only self that is fully yours, not inherited, not borrowed, not contingent on conditions that can change. Yours, because you built it in the one place no external force can reach or remove. Most people never find out who they are in that sense, not because they lack the capacity, but because they were never sufficiently stripped of the alternatives. The support held. The noise continued. The scaffolding never fully came down. They lived their whole lives inside a self that functioned perfectly well and belonged in ways they never had to examine, partly to everyone who had a hand in constructing it. You don't have that ambiguity. Everything that could be removed has been, or is being, removed. What remains, what you are discovering remains, is the only thing Jung ever considered worth the name of personality. Not the performance, not the accumulated approval, the thing underneath, which was always there, which the pressure did not create, but only revealed. That revelation is not the end of something. It is the beginning of the only kind of life that cannot be taken from you, because it was never given to you in the first place. The work ahead is not easier for knowing this, but it is clearer. And clarity, when you have been building in the dark, is everything. If this video awakened something in you, leave it in the comments. Not what you plan to do, but what you recognized. The next video will take this further into the uncharted territories of the psyche. Don't stop here. I'll see you there.